The funeral home smelled like wilting lilies and cheap air freshener. I am 52 years old and I work as a history teacher. My world has always been built on facts and verifiable timelines. My wife Elena's death from a sudden aneurysm had destroyed that world. Friends and family offered their quiet condolences in the reception hall. They spoke of her kindness and her gentle spirit over catered sandwiches. I just nodded and gripped a plastic cup of lukewarm water. That was when I first saw him standing near the memorial guestbook. He was an older man with a tired face and cheap suit. I assumed he was a distant colleague or perhaps a forgotten neighbor. He approached me slowly when the crowd started to thin out a bit. He said he was sorry for my loss with a strange intensity. He told me that he knew Elena from a long time ago. I thanked him for coming and expected him to leave with the others. Instead, he just stood there for a moment watching me carefully. He finally said his name was Caleb and that he was her husband. The words did not make any sense in that quiet, grief-filled room. I thought perhaps the stress had finally made me mishear something. He repeated that he was Elena's husband and that she never divorced him. He then placed a worn photograph on the table next to the flowers. It was Elena, much younger, standing beside him in a wedding dress. Her eyes in the picture held a terror I had never seen before. For 20 years, our life was a fortress of quiet, comfortable routines. We owned a small brick house where I would grade papers at the kitchen table. Elena worked from home, her keyboard clicking softly from the spare bedroom. She was the calm center of my world, a predictable and gentle presence. Our shared existence felt complete, needing nothing from the outside. I see now that this isolation was not romantic, but a deliberate form of defense. Her past was a blank page she never offered to fill with any real stories. She said her parents died in a crash and that she was an only child. This tragic simplicity explained her lack of family photos or holiday traditions. I accepted it all without question because her focus on me was absolute. We built our own world, a universe for two, which made me feel chosen, but there were countless small signs that I chose to completely ignore. She had a severe aversion to any kind of official paperwork or bureaucracy. When she renewed her driver's license, she would become agitated for weeks beforehand. I once won a cruise to the Bahamas at a school fundraiser event. She had a full-blown panic attack over needing to get a passport. She cried and said she was too claustrophobic to be on a ship. We gave the tickets away, and I felt guilty for pushing her. She also had no digital footprint, which she framed as a desire for privacy. No social media, no old email accounts, nothing linking her to a past life. I thought she was just an old soul in a modern world. The strangest moment was when I found an old folded roadmap of Nebraska. It was hidden in the lining of a winter coat she never wore. When she saw me holding it, a raw panic flashed in her eyes. She tore it from my hand and ripped it into tiny pieces. Her reaction was so violent and out of character, yet I let it go. I convinced myself it was just a strange, meaningless quirk. A few days after the funeral, I tried to dismiss the man's words. I told myself that grief was making me vulnerable to cruel opportunists. The photograph he left was unsettling, but ultimately proved nothing definitive. I attempted to return to the empty quiet of my life, grading papers and watering her plants, but his claim was like a splinter in my mind I could not remove. Then a thick manila envelope arrived in the mail, with no return address. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it on the kitchen counter. Inside was a certified copy of a marriage license from Hall County, Nebraska. The names on the document were Caleb Ward and Elena Petrova. The date was from 23 years ago, 2 years before I met her. There were also a dozen photographs of them together on a farm. They were surrounded by people I had never seen before in my life. Elena looked thin and tired, but she was unmistakably the same woman. She was holding a baby in one of the pictures on a porch swing. The illusion of my perfect marriage began to crack right there. I went to my study and turned on the computer with a cold dread. As a history teacher, I knew how to find public records online. It only took me 10 minutes to find the county clerk's official website. I typed in their names and the date from the certificate. The record appeared on my screen, a digitized and undeniable fact. My 2 decades of happiness felt like an elaborate and cruel forgery. The floor seemed to drop out from under me in that silent room. My first instinct was to find a logical way to disprove it. I thought it must be an elaborate scam targeting a grieving widower. Maybe this Caleb person found our names in a public obituary notice. He could have forged the documents and doctored the old photographs. This explanation felt flimsy, but it was better than the alternative. I spent hours online searching for information on bereavement scams. I tried to convince myself that this was a known pattern of fraud. I felt a surge of guilt for even entertaining these terrible thoughts. It felt like I was betraying Elena's memory by doubting our life. I needed someone to tell me that I was losing my mind. Elena had only one friend she kept in touch with from her past. Her name was Sarah, and she lived a few states away. They spoke on the phone a few times a year in quiet, brief conversations. I found her number and called her with a desperate need for denial. I explained the man at the funeral and the package I received. I described the marriage license and the photographs of a baby. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Sarah did not sound surprised, which was the most damning response. She just said that Elena's past was complicated and not her story to tell. She offered me condolences for my loss, but refused to say more. Her careful, evasive silence was a confession in itself, a clear confirmation. It was the moment my denial crumbled and was replaced by pure confusion. Sarah's silence gave me the grim permission I needed to keep digging. I went up to the attic, a space filled with our shared history. It was a place I had not entered since Elena had passed away. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a grimy window. I started searching through the boxes marked with her elegant handwriting. These contained old clothes, books, and other forgotten personal effects. Tucked away behind a stack of old winter blankets was a small shoebox. It was completely unmarked and sealed with yellowed strips of packing tape. I knew instantly that I had found something she never wanted me to see. I carried the box downstairs and cut it open on the dining room table. The first thing I saw was an old driver's license from Nebraska. It had her photograph, but the name on it was Elena Petrova. Beneath that was a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were written in a language I did not recognize at all. I also found a birth certificate for a boy named Michael Ward. The parents listed were Caleb Ward and Elena Petrova Ward. At the very bottom of the box was a small, folded newspaper clipping. It was an article about a young mother who had disappeared from her rural home. The grainy photo showed a terrified-looking woman who was clearly Elena. I finally had the truth, but it offered no comfort or relief. The evidence confirmed that the woman I loved was a complete stranger. The contents of the shoebox left me with no room for denial. I knew I had to face the man who had shattered my reality. I found Caleb's phone number through a simple online people search. I called him and arranged to meet at a sterile coffee shop downtown. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited for him at a small table. He arrived and sat down without any sense of formal greeting. I placed the birth certificate and the newspaper clipping on the table. I asked him to tell me what had happened to the boy, Michael. I needed to know the truth about the child she had left behind. He told me the baby had died from a fever a year after she disappeared. He said it with a cold flatness that chilled me to the bone. He spoke of Elena as if she were a possession that had been stolen. He called her his runaway wife and complained about the trouble she caused. His feigned sympathy was gone, replaced by a possessive and bitter anger. He said she was a weak woman who could not handle a real man's life. His knuckles were white as he gripped his coffee cup tightly. In that moment, I saw the monster she must have run from. My grief for the wife I lost was replaced by a fierce, protective rage. I was no longer a victim of her lies, but an heir to her fight. The coffee shop meeting poisoned everything that remained of my life with Elena. My grief was now a luxury I could no longer afford to feel. It had been replaced by the grim and consuming need for self-preservation. I stopped mourning the woman I knew and started seeing her as a survivor. Her 20 years of peace with me was not a life, but an armistice, and now the war she had fled had finally found its way to my door. Caleb called me 3 days after our meeting, his voice calm and reptilian. He spoke not of love or loss, but of legal frameworks and probate. He explained that since his marriage to Elena was never legally dissolved, he was her surviving spouse. He mentioned community property laws and his rightful claim to her estate. He suggested that the house I was living in was half his. He wanted to avoid a messy court battle that would be embarrassing for me. He framed his extortion as a reasonable and quiet business arrangement. The threat was not just about money, it was about erasure. He wanted to legally overwrite my own history with Elena. I felt a profound sense of isolation, a loneliness deeper than simple grief. I could not explain this situation to my friends or my colleagues. The story was too monstrous and too shameful to share with anyone. The day after his call, I met with an estate lawyer downtown. The lawyer listened with a detached professionalism that offered no comfort. He confirmed that Caleb could indeed file a claim against the estate. He said it would create a complicated and protracted legal fight. He used terms like discovery, depositions, and legal standing. My personal tragedy was being translated into a cold, bureaucratic language. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a contested piece of property. Every photograph on the wall felt like a piece of evidence. Every piece of furniture felt like a line item in a court filing. The fallout was not loud or dramatic, but a quiet, creeping contamination of my world. Leaving the lawyer's sterile office, I felt a profound and final shift. The legal system offered a slow, expensive, and uncertain path. It was a formal process that could not account for the human horror of my situation. I realized that fighting Caleb on those terms would be a mistake. He understood the language of threats and intimidation, not legal motions. A cold clarity settled over me as I walked through the city streets. I was done reacting to the ghosts of my wife's hidden past. I was done being a victim of a story that began before I existed. If Caleb wanted to turn our lives into a battlefield, I would not meet him with lawyers. I would meet him with a scorched earth policy of my own. That evening, I sat at my desk and opened our financial statements. I looked at the money Elena and I had saved for our retirement. I decided to weaponize the very assets that Caleb was trying to steal. The next day, I took a large amount of cash from our savings account. I spent hours researching and vetting private investigators with military or police backgrounds. I needed someone who was comfortable operating in morally gray areas. I found a man whose online reviews were sparse but brutally effective. I met him in a dimly lit bar on the industrial side of town. He was a large man with impassive eyes and a cynical expression. I gave him Caleb's name and last known address on a slip of paper. I told him I wanted to know everything about Caleb Ward's entire life. I wanted every mistake, every secret, and every skeleton he had ever hidden. I pushed a thick envelope full of cash across the table toward him. It was the first truly cold and calculated action of my entire life. The private investigator worked with a chilling and detached efficiency. He contacted me 1 week later, and we met in the same dark bar. He slid a thick file across the table without saying a single word. The report was a methodical dissection of a cruel and predatory life. It contained old police reports for domestic disturbances that were mysteriously dropped. It detailed a history of shady business deals and financial intimidation. The investigator had found 3 other women who had briefly dated Caleb. They described a man prone to fits of jealous rage and paranoia. He had a pattern of isolating women and then controlling their finances. The file was a portrait of the monster Elena had managed to escape. Reading it did not bring me any comfort, only a grim sense of purpose. As I was arming myself with information, Caleb began to escalate his own campaign. He was no longer content with making threats over the telephone. One afternoon, I saw him parked in his car across from my school. He was just sitting there watching the building as students left. He did not wave or make a gesture. He just made sure I saw him. The next day he was there again, a silent and menacing presence. He was marking his territory and showing me that he could touch my world. He wanted me to know that my quiet life as a teacher was not a shield. I felt like I was being hunted just as she must have felt. My fear was quickly being replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The tension had become a tightly coiled spring inside my chest. The sight of him near my school was the final violation I could tolerate. I called Caleb that evening and told him we needed to meet. I said I was ready to discuss a financial settlement to make him go away. I told him to come to my house the next night to finalize our arrangement. My home would no longer be a place of fear, but a stage for my final move. He arrived exactly on time, carrying an air of smug and confident victory. He walked into my living room and surveyed it like a man appraising his new property. He sat in the armchair that Elena had always favored as her own. I let him state his financial demands one last time. listening quietly. When he was finished, I did not argue or show any emotion. I simply placed the investigator's thick file on the coffee table between us. I watched his eyes as he saw the police reports and old photographs. I explained that I had no intention of going to the authorities myself. I told him that if he ever contacted me again, the file would be sent. It would go to every person he had ever wronged in his entire life. It would go to his estranged family and his former business partners. It would go to the women who had filed those police reports. I was offering him a different kind of justice, a more personal one. His smug expression dissolved into a look of pure, primal fear. I had taken his power by owning his entire sordid history. The final blow was not an act of violence, but one of information. He left my house without another word, a defeated and broken man. Caleb never contacted me again after that night at my house. He disappeared from my life as completely as he had entered it. The legal threats stopped and the quiet returned to my small world. But the silence that filled my home was no longer a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating emptiness that clung to the furniture and walls. I had won the battle, but the victory provided no relief or satisfaction. I had simply replaced one kind of haunting with another kind of haunting. The ghost of Caleb's menace was gone, but the ghost of my wife's deception remained. I sit in our living room now, looking at the life we built together. It all feels like an elaborate, well-constructed stage set for a play. I see the photographs of us smiling on vacations we took nearby. I see the books she loved neatly arranged on all of the shelves. I touch the paintings of birds she created in our quiet backyard. Nothing feels real to me and nothing feels like it was ever mine. My memories are now corrupted files that I can never open again. I look at her picture on the mantelpiece and I no longer see my wife. I see a desperate fugitive named Elena Petrova from Hall County, Nebraska. There was no comfort in learning her truth, and there was no peace in my victory. There is only the brutal, lingering fact that I shared my life with a stranger. If you enjoyed this video, support it with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your reaction helps me create new stories.